Good morning. Happy Father's Day. As we talked about last month on Mother's Day, this is not always a good day for people because we all have different experiences and different relationships and so forth. And, you go out into the world and there's greeting cards and people sharing their, sense of Happy Father's Day. And it may not be a happy day for you, for whatever reason. But the recognition is that, it is a day when we celebrate the idea of fatherhood. I just want to share, last night we were at a dance recital for our daughter Grace, and she's been at this dance school since she was, 6 or 4? And now she's 18. So that's a lot of recitals. And so it was kind of a special night for her and the other senior girls. But there was one, so we were there, and it's a very, large dance school. There were 37 numbers in the course of the recital. The good news is they're really accomplished dancers, so you get to see some really wonderful things. But there was one song, and the girls were like middle school age, I think, like 10 to 12 or 13. And they were dancing, and the song was called Daughters and Daddies or something like that. In the last minute of the song, all the fathers came out onto the stage to finish the dance with their daughters. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house. It was so sweet. And they all had a father that came out to dance, so that was nice too, because, these days you never know, right? So there is that kind of a specialness about parenting, about motherhood and fatherhood. And the reality is that we have an uneven experience of that across our culture. Some people had wonderful experiences with their parents growing up. Others, it was kind of mixed. And others, it was really not very pleasant, or the parent wasn't there at all. Or you didn't even know who your father was. So there is that kind of mixed experience that we need to take into account. But what I will talk about today primarily is about the idea of the male in our culture, the masculine in myth, and how that shows up today. We have up here on the lower half some of the older ideas of the masculine in myth, from the Greek gods to the knights and so forth, and Mercury, and then going across the top, some of the more recent ones. It may be when many of us were younger people and kids, it's what we grew up with. We grew up with the John Wayne idea and Mickey Mantle and Santa Claus being a male myth, Jackie Robinson. When you think about your childhood, who were the heroes, not necessarily of your childhood, but of your parents' childhood that they looked up to? And I know growing up, I was a child in the 50s, and then the idea to be a male was to be individualistic and very stoic, not to show your feelings, to be strong and silent. And certainly that still exists today, although maybe less so, because these things do change over time. And sometimes the current reality gets involved with the myth, and they don't necessarily equate too well. You're running the real father against the mythical image of the father. I don't know that too many are holding up Darth Vader as their father ideal, but it's certainly one of the defining father roles of the culture that grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The image of the father shifted earlier we were looking at when the cell phone thing, the father knows best, Robert Young. Back in the 50s on TV, the fathers were exemplary. It was Robert Young and Ozzie Nelson and people like that. And father knew best, And mom kind of stayed in the kitchen. It was sort of the way it worked. And when you had a real problem, you needed dad to solve it. Well, that's changed a little bit on TV. I don't know let me skip ahead to that and I'll come back to it, because now we have father images that are a little different than those days. Now father, in fact, does not only know best, you kind of want to avoid dad at all costs, pretty much. He may mean well, but doesn't necessarily show up in how things respond in our world. So, we've had a generation or two of kids grow up without necessarily seeing strong male role models, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that. The women's movement, the awakening of women, so the empowerment of women, and there has been a shift, and now, it's okay to show the father as kind of a goof, but it's not really okay to show the mother as a goof, whereas back in the 50s it was the opposite. If you remember back in the early 50s, or maybe you're all too young for that, but maybe you've seen it on reruns. Remember the Burns and Allen show with George Burns and Gracie Allen? And Gracie was a ditz. She was just, and Lucy, and, Ricky was the little more stable. Lucy was always scheming and all that stuff. Well, if you showed women like that today, unless they're single, you can't get away with it. See, when you show a married woman today, she's in control, she's in charge, she's smart, she's putting up with all these idiots around her. Okay, and that's fine. I mean, it's, but it's just interesting to see how we evolve and how we grow. Okay, our male role models today are different than they were a few decades ago. And you may not know who all these people are, but they're all nerds. Even LeBron James, well, he's not a nerd, but see, he wears glasses. And there's no prescription lenses in those glasses. He wears them, and now this is a big trend among athletes and others, is to look like you need glasses because it's cool to be a nerd. He said that's why he wears it. He wants to look like he's a computer geek. Okay, so isn't that interesting how the shift has become? One of the number one shows on TV is The Big Bang Theory. About a group of nerds. Okay, and then you have our friend Mark Zuckerberg, and you have Bill Gates, and you have, just this, it's just a whole shift in who the male heroes are today. There was a great scene in the show Modern Family where I don't know if you've seen that, but there's one daughter that's cool, and there's another daughter that's kind of nerdy and a straight-A student, and they're out, and there was a group of kids that were picking on the little brother that they both share, and they had taken away the little brother's remote control car or airplane or something, I forget what it was. Anyway, the younger girl goes up, and these guys just are entranced by her. They're in her grade at school, and she says, "Give me the toy." They give it to her, and they're like, "Will you go out with me? I love you." And she goes walking back, and her older sister's like, "What was that about?" Because she sees her younger sister as just a nerd. And the younger sister says, "You have your posse, I have my posse." So there's all these different changes going on. There's a wonderful book, we have some in our bookstore, that just came out. It's called The Hidden Spirituality of Men by Matthew Fox. And Matthew Fox is a brilliant, brilliant man. He was a Catholic priest for a long time in the Benedictine order. He was excommunicated by the current pope when he was in his previous job. So he's got that going for him. And I just want to share a little bit from this book. It's about the question he asks is, why have men, to greater and lesser degrees, hidden their spiritual lives? The reasons are almost endless, but often each man's reasons interlock in a tight web that keeps spirituality unacknowledged and unexperienced. And he says, here are just a few of the reasons. Because Western culture is still a dualistic patriarchy that values thinking over feeling, material wealth over spiritual, scientific fact over intuitive knowledge, men over women, and heterosexuals over homosexuals. Next, because men are rarely rewarded and often mocked for openly expressing their deepest feelings of joy, sensitivity, and pain. Because many men carry wounds inside they would rather forget or put aside than admit they are there. Because modern religions are out of touch with their mystical traditions whose language and concepts help us cope with our deepest experiences, our dark nights of the soul. Because often spiritual truth and understandings defy language and live in silence, and what is not lassoed by words is considered secret and kept hidden. Because men who are not supported to cry learn to hide their grief as well as their joy. Because in times of war, governments do not welcome the authentic, questioning spirituality of warriors, but want the religious obedience of soldiers. Because our anthropocentric culture puts more value on human life, needs, and rules than in connecting humbly to the vast cosmos. Because men sometimes work so hard that they do not have time or space to explore their hearts. Because in an attempt to respect the women's movement, some men feel compelled to silence themselves and hide any unacceptable maleness. Because homophobia robs men of their capacity to relate deeply to other men, even men who overcome homophobia must often keep this secret in an excessively heterosexist culture. Because men sometimes confuse religion and spirituality, and in the process run from their own journey with spirit. Because men lack rites of passage that demarcate movement from boyhood to adulthood, and such rituals that modern religions maintain, such as confirmation and bar mitzvah, fail to do the job. Because our culture more often rewards men for their extroverted rather than their introverted sides. Because there may be a hiddenness about all spirituality. What is deep is hidden, and a spiritual journey explores the unnameable aspects of divinity, the Godhead behind God. Because many men are mystics but lack the vocabulary to name what they experience. Because men learn only through ritual, according to Robert Bly, and substantive rituals are hard to come by in modern culture. Because men want to hide their shame and aggression, or at least hide from them. Because communication between boys and fathers is often cold or non-existent in our culture, and too many elders retire to the golf course rather than mentor younger generations. Because fatherless homes offer few role models for young men to emulate. Because an original sin ideology makes men doubt their beauty and right to be here, and teachings about God as a punitive father create a toxic, punitive role model. Because men don't know how and are not trained to deal with their anger and outrage in healthy ways. Because men, like all humans, can be lazy and will avoid the hard work of spiritual exploration if they can. And finally, because cynicism, depression, and exhaustion can make soul work seem pointless or overwhelming. It's just a few things. But we do, and Joseph Campbell, who I really love to study, spoke about this too in terms of the lack of a mythological underpinning of modern culture. He said, it's not that we don't have our myths, we do and we will. He said also, you never really know the myth of a culture until that culture is past. Because when you're living in the myth, it doesn't feel like a myth. But the ideas that we have about what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine and what it means to explore areas of your life that maybe don't fit into the rigid definitions of one or the other. The whole emotional area with men is very difficult. Because we do have at least the remnants of these older ideas about what we're supposed to be like. And as always, I realize that in a group like this, we're probably not mainstream, and yet these issues still apply here. When you look out into the world around us, into the world of business, into the world of politics, you don't see a lot of room for introspection. You don't see a lot of room or value in recognizing the joy of life. The only emotion there seems to be room for is fear and anger. Someone that steps up with a positive vision is often shot down for not seeing how bad things are. And I think what men do, and have done for a long time, is we compartmentalize. I think it's something we're sort of biologically geared to do. And women can do this too, but I think they do it less. I think, there's studies done on male and female brains, and this is a little bit controversial, but in general, if you pay attention, men tend to be good at compartmentalizing things, and women tend to be more relational in all their different areas of their life. And there are some women that are more like men in this regard, and some men that are more like women, but in general, it's true. There's a wonderful little video you can find on YouTube about male and female brains. It talks about, men's brains, if you took off the top of my head, there'd be a bunch of little boxes. And every different area of my life is in one of those boxes, and the boxes don't touch. And there's one box with nothing in it. And that's where you go when you're just doing nothing. Maybe when you're fishing and you're hoping you don't catch any fish. Or you're just sitting, staring at the TV, not really paying attention to it, or something like that. And I've noticed in my life that women have a hard time understanding this box. Because it doesn't relate to anything else. And it's just not doing anything. And I think one of the things about women's brains is women have trouble not doing it. You have to be doing something. I've noticed in my life many women who have difficulty relaxing because there's things to do, right? And they also have greater difficulty with the man in the house relaxing because there's things to do. How can you just be relaxing? There's things to do. And there's a list ongoing, in the woman's head about all those things, and the ones that aren't checked off. After everything's checked off, then you can relax. Well, the trouble is, and it's not that men have any great insight here, it's just that our boxes don't touch. The trouble is the checklist is never complete. But on the other side, if the man isn't in a healthy place, that doing nothing box becomes a place to hide, to shut out what you don't want to look at, to shut out. It's not that you don't want to do stuff, it's just that you don't want to have to think about what you're doing, and you don't want to think about the difficulties and all that stuff. There are a few things more rewarding in a man's life than being a parent, than being a father. But, as everyone knows, that can also be a very difficult path. The expectation is that you'll be good at it. The reality is you may not. The reality is that as men are cultured in our culture to hide their feelings, it becomes very difficult to express what's really going on, because I think part of the belief is people don't want to hear what my feelings are. I'm speaking in general. And I don't feel comfortable having them sometimes. So that can show up in a lot of different ways. It can show up as, my dad was very loving in general, but he would withhold a lot of his feelings, especially the negative ones, and when it was like a pressure cooker situation, eventually something had to give. And it wasn't very pleasant when it did. And I don't think that's that uncommon. And when you have that kind of frustration, you have that kind of difficulty in not, as he said, not being trained how to deal with anger, how to deal with sadness. Well, what do? You do what's expected of you. You self-medicate. Maybe you drink. Maybe you take drugs. Maybe you go the legal route and you use prescriptions. And what does that do? That takes you farther off center. And it becomes that much more difficult to deal with life. So we really have put ourselves as a culture into a very unhealthy place. I mean, when you just look at the numbers of prescriptions written in the United States, It's something like 7 times the population. So there are an average of 6 to 7 prescriptions or refills written per person. Over 1 billion prescriptions for 300 million people. And it's not, we know, when you get into a teaching like this, you know that so many of those physical, emotional symptoms come from what? Come from how we think. Come from how we think. Most of our ailments are lifestyle induced. Not all, but most. And even the ones that are genetic can be aggravated by being in emotional turmoil or being depressed or being angry or being whatever the case may be. Basically, the emotions that we get when we don't look at things and we don't deal with them. So what Matthew recommends here in this book is he takes men, or whoever wants to read this, through 10 archetypes of authentic masculinity. And an archetype, if you don't know what that is sort of a universal ideation of something, a universal symbol that means something across all humanity. And he looks at things like Father Sky in the cosmos, and the Green Man, and Icarus and Daedalus, and the hunter-gatherers, and the spiritual warriors, the Blue Man, the Earth Father, the Grandfather Sky, that have all been part of our older traditions. And we've kind of lost them. We've become not necessarily, I don't know if it's good or bad, but we've become so rational scientific that it becomes very difficult for us to think or feel or understand symbolism. Probably since the inventing of the printing press. We went from being symbolic thinkers to linear thinkers. Because, before you had books, before you knew how to read, you had to think in terms of symbols, because that's all there was. And people spoke in metaphors, and the stories had to be compelling and had to have these compelling characters that would cause you to remember the meaning of the story and so forth. And now we want to know, all the scientific stuff. And that's okay. It's just part of our evolution. But it does create some problems in terms of our understanding who we are at a deeper level. After reading through that list, I was thinking, it's not so amazing that we have so many dysfunctional fathers. It's amazing that we have so many functional ones. It's amazing that we have so many men that, despite that kind of enculturation, they're still there for their kids. And not just there physically, although that's a big step in many cases, but there emotionally as well. Because it's not easy in today's world to be a man, and I know it's not easy to be a woman. And we've gotten through a phase of there being increased antagonism between the genders as women have rightly reestablished their power in the process of doing so. And being a man in this time has meant a lot of confusion. When I was growing up, when I was a little kid, it was pretty clear how to be a man. You opened doors for women, you treated women appropriately, although obviously a lot of that didn't happen. But then when you get into the late part of the 20th century, what are you supposed to do? I remember going out on dates back when I was single and opening a door and the woman being offended. I'll do that myself, thank you. Okay, What else don't you want me to do? And it's confusing, and I'm sure it was equally confusing for her. But when we, quite often, the first stage of awakening of anything tends to be a little militant. and it tends to set people apart. Because part of the motivation of the awakening seems to be to resist the other that has been dominant. And you see this over and over and over in the civil rights movement and so forth. So we're a little confused. That's okay. We'll get over it. A couple of generations down the road, everything will be fine. There was a very touching scene this week. I was watching a rerun of Everybody Loves Raymond. And he was talking to his dad, and they were going to go do a Civil War reenactment, which was important to his dad. And Raymond wanted to go just because he wanted his dad to ask him to go. And they were arguing about it because it turned out Raymond could go, but he had to be on the Confederate side, which was a problem, apparently. And his father said, why did you even want to go? He says, because I wanted to do things with you, like you did with your dad. And his father just fell silent. And Raymond said, well, you did do things with your dad, didn't you? And his father stayed silent for a while, and then he finally said, no. No. My dad beat me every day. He didn't do things with me. And that Raymond never knew that. And he said, and his father says to him, I tried to be a little better than my father. And he says, you're better than me. You're a good father. And Raymond says, oh, I'm okay. He says, maybe my kids will be better than me, and then in a few generations it'll be straightened out. And that's a very realistic portrayal, I think, of our culture. You know, it wasn't that long ago, 100 years or so ago, and beyond that, where in the Victorian era, where children were to be seen and not heard. And they were more objects than people. And that's just the way everybody was conditioned to believe. And, you know, we've made tremendous strides in a century. You know, which may not seem that great since your lifespan will probably be a little less than that. You know, when does it get better? Well, maybe in a generation or two. Maybe in your family it gets better today because you start to think differently. And the awareness that we have is that we're all in this together, that the only answer is to love one another, even if the other is a pain in the butt. And that any tactic of separation doesn't work ultimately. It's a tough lesson for many of us. It's a tougher lesson probably for men just because of the way we're encultured. I didn't play love one another when I was a kid. I played war. I played cowboys and Indians. I remember when Kennedy was shot, and then the next day or the day after, whatever it was, Jack Ruby shot Oswald. We went right out and played bringing Oswald through the sheriff's department. And somebody'd be Ruby and run up and shoot Oswald, and Oswald had to fall down, and everybody else would jump on Ruby and beat him up. Then we get up and do it again. It's just what we did. You know, I remember reading recently an article about a woman who said, my boys are not going to play with guns. So she bought them, I don't know what the hell she bought them, but stuff that wasn't guns. So they took a banana and they were shooting at each other with a banana. There's just something about being a boy that there, you know, some elements of that are innate. They're going to show up. And usually the maturation of a man into a true man is to learn to cultivate the strength you've been taught and turn it into gentleness. To be a friend of mine who was on the police department with me used to talk about being strong enough to be gentle rather than weak enough to be cruel. So we don't want to get rid of the warrior. We want the warrior to become what is known in mythology as the golden warrior. The golden warrior is that warrior who all of his battles are internal, because that's the only place that needs to have any battle, is for you to bring yourself into alignment and harmony with who you really are. But before I can do that, I got to say, well, the world outside of me is okay. And that, looking around, we're not encouraged to do that very often, are we? If a politician says everything's okay, they want to kick them out of office. Don't tell me everything's okay. I'm highly invested in things being screwed up. Think about it. Think about how we respond. And think about how little it takes to get us to think things are screwed up. If everything isn't perfect. There's a great video going around, the comedian Louis C.K. It's about a year or so old, but he's on Letterman or Leno or one of those shows, and he's talking about how things have never been better on the planet, and yet none of us is happy. He said you can get into an airplane and fly 600 miles an hour to your destination, and they bring you drinks and snacks and things like that, and people are furious about flying. He says, fine, get your butt in a covered wagon and take 3 weeks to go across the country, and half of you die. How would that work for you? But you think about it, you think about it. Somebody doesn't change lanes properly in front of you, and you just road rage. God forbid you get there one car length later. That's really what you're angry about when you think about it. That's almost 30 feet. Going 60 miles an hour. Well, not on a highway, you're going 12, but Right? I mean, think how easily people get outraged. And we recognize that it's never about the thing, that what's inside is just churning all the time. Pressure cooker, pressure cooker, pressure cooker, building up, building up, building up. Why? In part, because we are conditioned to feel powerless, and in another part, because we don't know how to deal with the emotions that build up in a healthy way. We try to stifle everything. Remember when Archie Bunker would say to Edith, "Stifle, Edith." And the real revolutionary aspect of that show was that it was the first one to show a father that didn't know best. So we can thank Norman Lear for all this. So today, I think we want to be hopefully realistic. To know that the masculine energy that we all share, it's in both genders, is a magnificent and amazing thing, but it has to be trained, it has to be channeled, it has to be expressed in a way that's consistent with our highest and best. Just like the feminine energy in us. And I'm just going to close with this little reading. The author's unknown, but it sort of speaks to today. Today is for the fathers. It is for the grandfathers, uncles, brothers, friends, and sons. For the most important man in anyone's life, the one who gave us life. Here's to you, the dads who play endless games of go fish with their kids and always let them win. And those who always played to win every time, thinking that the children would grow stronger through defeat. This is for the fathers who worked in fields and factories, taught in classrooms, or sat in office cubicles 8 long hours a day. Here's to those who performed life-saving surgery and those who drove their truck through long days and nights. Here's to those who loved every minute of their labor and to those who only worked so their families could survive. To the sleepless dads who have waited in silent fear that their babies wouldn't make it through the night, or their teenagers survived their first time driving alone. To those who lost children, those who found them in different ways. Here's to tears not shed and hugs not given for fear of appearing weak. Here's to dads who build with hammer and saw and those who wouldn't know how. The fathers who are afraid of spiders and yet can slay the great dragon of fear in his little ones. The fathers who tried and those who didn't. The fathers who gave us life and walked away, and those who stayed long past the life of their marriage to give something to the children. The fathers who hurt because their children have been kept from them, and those who are both father and mother. Stay-at-home dads and stay-away dads, the ones we wanted but never knew. The helpless, hurting father and the brave, strong one. And for all the ways of fatherhood, here's to you. So thank you, and namaste.